speaking on India's tryst with climate concerns, and they shall be in conversation with Paroma Roy Chowdhury. We have Navroz from our previous session, so I will not waste much time with his introduction since Mr. Grewal has a flight to catch. Bikram Grewal grew up in the dense evergreen forests of India's northeast, where he first developed his love for natural history. He has written over 30 books on Indian wildlife, travel and entertainment, and made a publishing career and worked in England, Hong Kong and Singapore before returning to Delhi. He now devotes his time to the conservation of Indian wildlife, especially working on rare birds. When not traveling, he spends his time between his farm in Dehradun, where he grows rare plants, and his boat in the Sundarbans. Paroma Roy Chowdhury, our moderator for the day, studied political science in Presidency College for her undergraduate and graduate studies and completed a press fellowship from the University of Cambridge, UK. She's a business journalist turned public affairs professional and has held leadership positions in global organizations. She's an ardent champion of free expression and inclusion and a keen observer of politics. She also loves literature, contemporary Indian art, music, films, and good conversation. Here's looking forward to another engaging session on climate change. I'll hand over the stage to Paroma.
This a little fun, if possible. So just for context, Ratan Tata had a very interesting tweet this morning. He said that the idea is not how much more we can ravage the planet, but it's time to think how much we can really give back at this time and try to salvage whatever is left of it. So I think that's a really good note to start. That what can we do? What can citizens do? What can the civil society do? The political system, the media, everybody is a player in the climate game. So let's focus a little bit on that. Of course, Navroz is extremely well qualified. He's an academic. He's a professor at Center of Policy Research and a very, very serious voice. He's worked in the US and here across many government bodies, non-profit, etc. So he has a really global perspective. Bikram has a fascinating life. He has a farm in Dehradun and a boat in Sundarban. and he sort of lives between the two places, and he's a grassroots activist. So they bring fairly different perspectives. And I also got pretty fascinated about an earlier panel where we spoke very heavily on the multidisciplinary approach, the linkages between science and literature and arts. So all this makes for a very fascinating conversation, what each of us can do. So if we establish that this needs a multi-pronged approach, and with participation from many people. So I'll start with Navroz, that what would be the institutional aspect of it? Where do we start?
So thank you so much, Paroma. I actually would say that the starting point, and maybe I can make this a little biographic, is not necessarily with the institutional aspect. That we have to end up there for sure. But we have to pass through, I think, to pick up the strand from the last session, we have to pass through the conversation that we have in this country and globally on climate change. If I might just sort of wave this around, because, so just biographically, I've been working on this since 1990 through the international process, because in 1990 when you talk climate change, it was only a diplomatic issue. It was only a negotiation issue. Over the years, it's become an issue that occupies people. And it's certainly something that should occupy us as Indians. But when I started thinking about, when I moved to the Center for Policy Research in 2009, there wasn't material to engage young people who are asking about it. And so I pulled together a collection of people writing, and this book is an effort to update that collection. So one of the things is we have to talk about this in multiple ways, in informed ways, understanding that different people will have different perspectives, and we have to find ways in which we can mirror our own images in these perspectives.
Can I just interrupt you for a minute?
Yeah.
Please look at this book. It's Navroz's book, and it's called India in a Warming World, Integrating Change and Development. This is a very, very important dialogue. That we're talking about integration, we're talking about collaboration, and it's a multidisciplinary approach that we need. Navroz's book is an open book. It can be downloaded for free, and of course the copy is available here. So sorry to have interrupted you. Please go on.
No, thank you. So just to add on that, so there are some 35 odd authors in this. So the real effort is to pull together different voices: diplomats, civil society activists, practitioners, policymakers, urban planners, and so on. So it's meant to be an invitation to this conversation, and as Paroma said, you can download it freely from the Oxford University Press website or from my own organization's website. So I think we are just starting to have this conversation in India as to what it means. For many years, the conversation has been really a north-south conversation. That, look, we have more pressing issues to think about, and that's a powerful argument. We do have a lot of pressing issues to think about. Our politics are getting more and more constricted. We have basic issues of health and education. How are we going to think about things like the Anthropocene and ice core data from 800,000 years? And the sad part of it is that those immediate issues are going to get harder and harder to solve with climate change. Crop yields are going to go down. Cities are going to get flooded more often. Labor productivity is going to go down. So if you're a poor country, you can't actually say, we'll deal with that when we get rich, because climate change itself becomes a bigger and bigger obstacle to us having a better quality of life. So I think that sort of, we'll think about this later approach is no longer tenable. And maybe I'll come back to what I think is tenable, but I think that's our starting point. We have no choice but to engage with climate change, despite the fact that we have other pressing issues to worry about.
I mean, sort of everyone is a player in this game. So turning to Bikram, you have a very, I hope that you have a different perspective, that of really working at the grassroots. And tell us a little bit about your experience.
Now, before I do that, I think we've got the theory part sorted out. If you heard his previous session, everybody's talking about the theory. I think we have worked enough on it. It's now to deliver what we talk, to put the work on the table. Before we decide what we ought to do, what are we doing now? The answer is zilch. Whether nationally and internationally, certainly nationally, we think that there's no such problem. We'll tackle it. Are you going to wait, which is going to happen very quickly, I assure you, till Calcutta is under 6 feet of water? Are you going to wait for that? It's coming. First cyclones used to come in a circle of around 20 years. If you study the history of cyclones on the East Coast, between the coastal Bengal, coastal Orissa, you're getting it back at about 10 years now. And you are due any day now, maybe within the next year, a huge cyclone coming your way. Will it be then that you will wake up? We all talk about, I just don't want to hear another word on theory of what. It's time that we start doing something about it. And that is not what. I think there are people better qualified than me, like Navroz, who can talk about what we can. But even in small ways, none of us is the same. We pretend that the future does not exist. And this nature has a terrible way of coming back and biting at you. If you witness, for the first time, Madras, 600 people dead. Bombay, Ladakh, Kerala. Who had heard of for floods in Ladakh? The way your glaciers are melting is going to happen more and more. So let's recognize it. Let's do something tangible about it. Because the government is not doing anything. It's just shut his eyes. It's got, like he said, more pressing problems of whatever it is, Hindutva, whatever it is. Hindutva is not going to stop from the floods coming. It's not. So let's put that aside. Lord Ram cannot help you on that front. He can't. So it's up to you. It's in your capable hands and the future. The young kids that who can do it. And just one more minute before, is that we have other problems in India, which make the problem worse. For instance, we cut off trees because there's so much money in it. Today, smuggling is not gold or cocaine, it's timber smuggling. So we are cutting off and then we say, oh, we have planted so many trees in return, which will take 50 years to grow. And you assuage your conscience and you make a fool of the others. So we have multiple problems, which if you add on to the back of the climate change, it is pure disaster.
It's interesting that a very young girl raised this point in one panel this morning, that the hardest problem to crack is a change in behavior. Because look at the developing world. If, you have had the ability, finally have the ability to consume. And now you're telling me to cut back on my consumption when finally I can afford it. Think about it.
Yeah.
Someone who couldn't afford, maybe the parents couldn't afford electricity. The children, the next generation can afford an air conditioner. It's very, very difficult to explain to such a person that you must give up your control over your immediate environment to have long-term sustained gains. And that is a very hard challenge. The same girl said that, look, I can tell my parents that don't drive, but they've just got a new big car. They're not going to listen to me. So I find this conundrum particularly difficult in the developing world like India. That a very privileged urban demographic has started seeing the benefits of not using single-use plastic and so many other things. But it's really not percolating down, and yet it's the lowest strata of society or is getting affected the most. I mean, how many kilometers women in a Rajasthani village have to walk to get just one pot of water? So it's a very interesting conundrum. So how do you think we can crack it?
So I think it's long, the reality is, as you put it, that there is now, India is at the threshold of consumption levels, of a steep increase in consumption levels. And that's very addictive. And let's be clear, industrialization has brought us to this point. As Dubash Chakravarti said in the last session, on the back of fossil fuels, but it also brought lots of other things. Mortality rates came down, people became healthier, we had all kinds of things like this that we didn't have before, which is a very mixed blessing, of course, to most of us. But it's very hard to give up these things. Politically, if we say climate change, solving climate change means reversing what many people see as the course of progress, I think we're stuck. I think what we need to do is re-envision a new form of progress. If you are tied, let's just take it this way. Here, we in India, the elite in India, who would never think of getting on a bus in Delhi or in Kolkata, will happily pull out their iPhone and look at the metro map in London or Paris and hop on a metro and think of themselves as being modern and forward-looking and progressive. We need to change the imagination of what it means to be forward-looking and progressive. It doesn't mean having your own car. It should mean walking places to an efficient system of public transport, getting there in a way that is timely, that is reasonably comfortable, and that is also healthy because you're building some walking into your life. Right? So that's a shift in the imagination. That's something that our colleagues in the humanities can help us with. It also requires the government, because you have to have public transport systems that work, and you have to tax the hell out of private cars, frankly, right? And introduce congestion charges. You need to nudge the public and make it possible, both carrot and stick. So the state has to be involved, and you need to vote for a state that will do that. So we need this kind of whole system change that involves behavior, involves policy, and involves imagination.
It also involves a fair amount of corruption. Everybody's very worried about the economic slowdown, and particularly in automobile sales. Now, automobile, I don't need to sort of spell it out, all of you know what I'm talking about. They're great funders of political parties. I completely agree with you that you need to have a proper infrastructure And partly people go and take tubes in London because they work. It's happening in Delhi because we have a proper metro system. Now to catch a bus in Kolkata is not the easiest thing to do. So we have to do it. So that's what I kept saying. Individually we can do it, but it's ultimately the establishment which has taken the first leap forward. I think it's much better to get hospitals or roads or proper this thing than building statues. But the narrative has shifted. And it is partly shifted for, well, political reasons. Now, how do you correct it? Like one of the answers was that you choose a proper government. So it's quite a complicated thing. But to revert to her earlier question is what are we doing in India? The subject of this talk is India's tryst with climate change. And if we revert to this subject, we know part of the solution. But what are we doing? Either individually or collectively or as an establishment. What do you think we are doing, Palo?
No, actually, I had a question specifically for you before we get back to our original point. That you work in the Sundarbans,
Yes.
which is a very ecologically sensitive and endangered area.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole of Bengal Delta is.
Yeah.
I mean, in 50 years later, we may not even exist. So, and I found it pretty astounding that it's not part of a larger discourse as it should be. But getting back to my point, that you actually work at the grassroots. Do you think understanding is percolating down there?
They are
among
helpless.
people who, they're helpless.
You see, they can't, they're helpless. Completely helpless. It's one of the poorest parts of the country, right? It was hammered by a terrible cyclone called Alia about 10 years back. I was there when it happened. It was a complete disaster because the government didn't respond at all. It was the Pada boys from Calcutta who saved the situation. They all got together, whatever they had in their house, rice, medicine, blankets, waters in plastic bags, and they all turned up. Now what happened, which is indicative of why I say the state was missing at that time, was there's a very small road, a thin road, to a place called Godkhali, which is from where the road ends and then the water boats take over. That road was choked for 20 kilometers because of the overwhelming response. So we couldn't distribute the food. And of course, certain business communities moved in and bought over all the food, bought over everybody's land because, there was no water to drink and for nothing. That's not the point. But the point is today, for instance, the southern 24 Farganas or the south 24 Farganas is the bowl from all the maids come to Calcutta.
Right.
Yeah. So all the maids who come and work in your house come from that area. They take a train in the morning, work in 5-7 different houses. Now, the catch, I'm not even going to ecological disasters, where we have the Irrawaddy dolphins doing a mass suicide. Nobody's even interested. But there are cases where they're just coming in, so I'm not even getting into finer this thing. But yields have gone down because the bunds have broken. Nobody is repairing the bunds. As you know, it's an embankment. So productivity is down. There's not enough food. The migration has started. I'm not even talking about the 2-inch rise in seawater because a great part of the Sundarbans is now getting inundated. And I'm told it's even worse in Pakistan, Sindh, where you're losing 80,000 acres a day. So unfortunately, whatever the cause of the climate change is, America uses 20 times the electricity we do. But it's people like us in our area who's going to get affected first. And there'll be a stage, already there's, riots and things like that, communal riots, and with, let's say, 1 million people or something coming into Calcutta, you're not going to be able to cope with it. So when you ask me what I do there, we have multiple problems. We have man-animal conflict. It's the poorest part. There's no hospital. So we work with people. We try and make them understand. But their initial thing is, where am I going to get my next meal from? So you know, what happens 10 years later, I don't know, but I'm really concerned about my next meal, which is a serious problem and a genuine one.
What also astounds me is that, I would still think that there is understanding in major cities like Delhi. There are enough seminars on climate change and enough experts talking. I don't knock that. But there is really lack of serious discourse in, say, media.
Or schools, or education.
Or civil society.
Or civil society.
Where you can really percolate the learning down. Of course, the government has a role to play. You cannot wish them away. And the political system has a role to play. And one of the reasons that actually Aam Aadmi Party can win in Delhi is that pollution is one of the electoral planks. For the first time in history.
Yep.
So I think this general understanding needs to percolate down and become a much larger part of the discourse. How can we make that happen?
So first of all, on the level of awareness and knowledge and engagement in different sort of classes of society, I actually think that those who are closer to nature for their livelihoods have a much better sense actually of what is going on than the urban elite. So for example, there are cases, we've already talked about the Sundarbans, the cases of Himachal growers, apple growers in Himachal, where the optimal altitude for growing apples has actually moved up the slope. So whole communities are actually finding that they can no longer grow apples viably and they have to move further up the slope until eventually a push off the mountain, or communities have to entirely adjust their livelihood strategies. Similarly with fisher communities, where fisheries are actually migrating as the water temperature changes. So I think there's a much more awareness of it in communities that are more directly dependent on natural resources in the environment for their livelihoods.
Navroz, but what can they do about it? No, I accept that.
I agree.
For instance, you mentioned the apple thing. It's also linked with other things.
Yeah.
The bees are disappearing.
Yeah.
So what can the people who are suffering, who understand it, who live it every day,
right,
their hands are much more tied.
So I think we are in a situation where we have to reconcile ourselves to one thing. We are not going to limit the impact of climate change to zero. If we do a lot, we will limit the impact to 2.5 to 3 degrees. Now, these numbers are shorthand. 2.5 to 3 degrees doesn't sound like a big deal. It's 2 degrees warmer today than it was yesterday. What's the big deal? That's not the point. Actually, a degree, so we've seen a degree rise in temperature, and this is the difficulty of translating science to actually how you know and feel about something. Already at a degree rise, we have disrupted the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle in ways that lead to many more cyclones. Warmer oceans can hold, warmer oceans lead to more, a warmer air can absorb more water vapor leads to more violent storms. It's very simple physics. So at 1 degree, we've already seen the most violent storms in history in a most concentrated period over the last decade. So we're going to see more of this. At 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees, it'll be much, much more, and it's not going to be just in a straight line more. It'll probably be exponential, curving upwards. So one answer to your question is that we have no choice but to think hard about adaptation. Right? We have to think about that, which means rethinking Indian agriculture so that we don't necessarily just have a wheat-rice cropping cycle. We have to think about coarse grains. We have to rethink building infrastructure in coastal areas. We have to start preparing our cities to be more prone to floods. So we have to invest in adaptation. But because we cannot adapt to a world that is 4 or 5 degrees warmer, we simply cannot. The cost will be enormous. We have to also mitigate, that is, we have to reduce our emissions. So the answer is, at a very high level, is clear. We have to do both these things. We have to we have to actually think, as Mark in the previous panel put it, we have to shift our imagination from a parasitic relationship to the earth to a mutualistic relationship to the earth, where we're not continuously drawing on it and giving nothing back. Now, that's again sounds, as you put it, very theoretical. Let me bring it down to a couple of concrete things. We need to remake public transport systems in our cities, right? And you talked about the Aam Aadmi Party and air pollution. Yes, but why did the Aam Aadmi Party start talking about air pollution? Because there's been more citizen voice and engagement than ever before. So they're being shoved towards it. So my organization, not me directly, was part of an effort where the resident welfare associations of Delhi got together before the elections, 3 or 4 months before the elections, and wrote a platform on what citizens want to see on air pollution, and shared it with all the parties and said, when you write your platform, take this into account. So citizen organizing is absolutely where it starts. So I think that is an essential part of the story as well.
In fact, this book has a very interesting structure. It's broken up into what the government can do, what the policy changes that we require, what can political parties do, what can civil society do, and very importantly, what can the media do in trying to raise awareness. Again, it might seem theoretical, but there are lots of really interesting stuff under each one of these heads that what we can do. So I think it's really important I come back again to build consensus and build platforms which invite participation and action rather than talk. So, if we can quickly go to Bikram and find 2 suggestions onto how we can actually do this, and Navroz, and then we will invite some questions.
I think the only hope really lies in the younger generation. So we have to inculcate information about the disasters or the pros and cons of climate change. It should be a compulsory subject. And we should try and spend, because I don't see help coming from the establishment in the near future. And we always act, after the act, where we try and cobble together some kind of thing. So it's really the young generation which can start. And you have a valid question that she's just learned consumerism, why should she give it up and all that? She will willy-nilly, perforce, have to do it one day. So I think that is the best thing, is to work with students, even in a small way. Even if she tells her father that, you don't need to put on the air conditioner 1 hour before you enter your room. And this all adds up, And when I talk to school children, which I do all the time, they have really good responses and they are really worried. So I think that's really the only way, because I don't see the media coming into play, I don't see the establishment coming into play in the near future till a big disaster hits us.
We need more Gretas in the world.
Yes, we do.
Yes, and I can give you a really small example. I live in a suburb of Delhi called Gurgaon, which is, ultra-consumerist, if I may say so. But I have seen in the last 5 years, crackers being stopped entirely because of a campaign by school children.
Yes.
It was so effective, and without raising a hue and cry, crackers do not, people don't burst crackers there anymore. If you do, you'll be a social outcast. It has come to that. So this is a wonderful small example of really what the young people can achieve. And I'm sure there are many bigger ones. But Navroz, your suggestion.
Yes, I don't want to leave everybody with the impression that this is entirely hopeless and that nothing has happened, right? Because there are some important things that has started. Now, because of the scale of this problem, it's like moving a super tanker around, right? Turning a super tanker 90 degrees. It takes a long time. You move the tiller and then about 5 minutes later you start seeing some motion. So we're starting to move the tiller. And there's a few glimmers of motion. So let me, and I think, again, I say this again, it has to be at the level of individuals and individual choices. It has to be at the level of what we do in our communities, like Gurgaon. It has to be at the level of what we do with citizens. And it has to be all of these 3 things together, because no single one of them will do it. Let me give you one example. 5, 7 years ago, the projections, so India was very much making this argument, we need energy, our electricity consumption is 1/13 of the US, how can we develop, blah, blah, blah. And the projections of coal-fired power plants in India, we have about 200 gigawatts, a gigawatt is 1,000 watts of coal capacity. It was projected to go up to 500, some people said 600, and so on. Now, the government says that we probably need 50 gigawatts, so 500 to 50. Now, 50 is not a small number. It's actually the size of all of South Africa's coal-fired power plants. It's still a lot. But what's interesting is no private investors will invest in coal-fired electricity anymore in India. And that has happened because renewable energy has come down. If you invest in a coal-fired power plant, you have to think that you're going to make money on it not just today, not just tomorrow, but 30 years into the future to recover your investment. Renewable energy is cheaper now, right? Now, there are some issues with making this transition. It's a complicated transition. It also means that coal mining areas in India, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, etc., might start losing jobs. We have to figure out how to compensate them for that. But the point is, we are embarked, we've started on a very complicated transition where our industrial future is going to be based on renewable energy and not on coal. There will be disruptions, there will be people losing money, there will be people left in the dark, there may be people who are already in the dark who won't get light. All of these things we have to manage. But this process has started. And this is, in a sense, one of the challenges of our time for this next generation. This battle will be won or lost in the next 10 to 15 years, and a lot of it will depend on how fast we make that transition and how smoothly we make that transition. But the transition has started. So please be aware that there are debates you can get into. What is the future of your city? What is the future of your electricity system? What is the future of, well, for example, air pollution, which is closely tied in its causes to climate change. These are all battles that you can start engaging in. And I think if we're going to solve climate change, as I said in the last session, we have to make it real. It can't just be at the level of numbers like 450 parts per million and a carbon budget of 1,000 gigatons. Leave that to the technical folks to add that up. But figure out how we can change the course of India's development trajectory to both make it more low carbon based and more climate resilient. That's a question that you can start engaging in your cities, in your communities. And that's the way we have to think about this.
In fact, I work for a company which has renewables as part of its product mix. And the signs are very encouraging. Infrastructurally, in adoption. India is a land of the sun. We have plentiful sunshine, also wind energy. It's a question of harnessing these. And of course, there's a cost. You're absolutely right. But that's the future, truly. Can we have a round of questions? And then I'll come back to the panel for final comments. Keep it really brief, and so that we can take as many as possible.
Sir, there is this lack of consensus in policy circles and everywhere actually, that how can we tackle this problem of climate change, sir? Because suddenly shifting from fossil fuel to renewables is very difficult. And in several countries, wherever they've tried to impose some taxes on fossil fuels, it has been met with a backlash. And just one thing, in USA, the key constituents of the president are coal miners, coal workers, and the lobbyists and the fuel lobbyists. So, ma'am, how does it happen if at last the people who decide are influenced by these considerations? So how can we expect positive things?
So you're right to say that you're not going to make this change happen if you're swimming upstream politically, right? So what do you do about that? What you do about that is you have to be clever about it. You change the nature of the game. Okay, so one of the things that activists have done is they have said, okay, if we have only, from a climate point of view, only a certain amount of coal, oil and gas that can be burnt without breaking the carbon budget, that means that those companies that own those coal, oil and gas reserves are not going to be able to burn some share of that, 50, 60%. That means that when the stock market looks at how valuable that company is, they're artificially inflating the price of that company because they think that they're richer than they are. So can we please have coal companies, oil companies and gas companies tell us what they think their assets are worth in a future world where there will be climate regulation? And the Bank of England governor said, that's a great idea. And investors started factoring that in. Okay? Now, when that happens, what happens? Financial industry that Paroma works for says, you know what? It's going to be more, we're going to want you guys, the coal industry, to pay more for a loan than we wanted you to pay for a few years ago, because you're less rich and less good a credit risk than we thought you were. Right? The politics changed. Coal miners in the Appalachian region are in a difficult position. But whatever Trump does, he's not going to be able to bring coal back. And that's why we have to think about, we don't want to make the climate transition on the backs of poor people in India, which is why we have to think about Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh up front and think about their livelihoods as well. So this is so I'm not a climate fundamentalist in the sense that I say that's the only important problem. We can't do this in a way that builds a socially unequal society. It has to be low carbon, but it also has to be socially equal. Right? So we have to find ways of shifting the politics is my short answer. The long answer is that's how it's done.
This lady had a question. The one in the poncho, and then we'll come to you.
In a country where 70% of the population is living in villages and trying to find out where they're going to get their next meal from, and the 30% that stay in the big cities or towns are mostly indulging in a more consumerist sort of behavior, well, say 20%. So we have a 10%, which is a very big number again, which is actually becoming aware. And if the government sits back and waits for us to come and choose a government which is actually going to take a step towards making a change, do you think this is really going to get us anywhere? It's very difficult. I think the other way around is we are used to force. We are used to having things forced down our throat. So if we have more stricter policies, and just not a taxation system which is taxing us, but a reward scheme, where if you're doing something better for the environment, you're going to get extra points on it, or like tax benefits out of it, then don't you think it's going to work better, especially for the affluent? That always works better, because people mostly in India are very materialistic in the head. So actually, I think you would be...
I agree with you completely, but the question is of compliance. You know, you said tax. We all know how the taxation system in India works. So we have to factor these points in when we come up with it. But what you are saying is quite right, both in terms of numbers. The poor people who don't even pay tax are the ones who are getting really hurt. And the rich have ways around it. So while your suggestion is very good, it's just the compliance that I'm a bit worried about.
So because a panel where everybody agrees with each other is never any fun, let me disagree a little bit. I think that we are fooling ourselves if we think we are going to solve this problem in ways that run against political currents. I don't think, in a democracy, I don't think any long-term sustainable solution is is viable if you have to constantly do things that are electorally unpopular. I think we have to change it so that it becomes electorally popular. So I disagree with you that this is only a 10% problem. The farmers, but I actually, that's where I disagree with you. So right now we had farmers coming, just before the elections, we had hundreds of thousands of farmers in the streets in Mumbai. We have farmer suicides. The dots have not been joined between those farmer suicides and climate change. But the dots are there to be joined. And in the future, it's only going to get worse. So actually, as I said, it is the 70-80% dependent on natural resources who should be exercised politically about this. It's a communication and an imagination challenge. So finding ways to both make our agriculture more resilient as well as ways of making our economy low carbon would benefit those people the most. And we have to weave that. I'm not saying that we should make climate change a political issue as climate change. We have to make climate change a political issue as a farmer distress issue, as a public transport issue, as an air pollution issue, and then 90% of the population will be on the side of action. But we have to change the way we talk about it.
This young girl here, she's been raising her hand.
Yeah. I would tend to agree with what Navroz has said, that it's not a good idea to be hopeless. Because just about today or yesterday, I saw an article in the Times of India main page in Calcutta. You know, when you have compulsions affecting your own children, there's a decision by the government of West Bengal. There's a decision by the government of West Bengal that henceforth, 1st April onwards, all school children will not be going to school in private cars, either pool cars or buses. Now, these are little things, but they go a long way. So I can well appreciate Mr. Grewal's cynicism that state governments will not do. But when there are compulsions, they start acting the other way.
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with you more. And it's a very good move. I mean, if this, I didn't know about it. I mean, this is very laudable.
Okay, so my question was to Bikram sir, because he works with the grassroots level, but it's open to everyone. How do we tackle the skepticism regarding climate change that is in the local government or the regional governments? Because, for example, I live in an area which was a part of the East Kolkata wetlands, and now it's a thriving area of commercial concrete buildings.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, and people are still encouraging that. Like the local councillor we have, she actually likes the fact that the area is very profitable in that manner. She does not take into consideration, or the local parties not take into consideration the profit factor of the East Kolkata wetlands, which save the state billions of dollars in sewage management. Because we do not have a system. The East Kolkata wetlands does it all.
You know, I don't know if you know, but the Sundarbans actually started from the East Calcutta wetlands. I mean, that's the start of that. And it prevented flooding for many, many years. Now, you know, it's very difficult, and we've been talking about greed versus the future. I don't know, Navroz, here, because the need is much greater than, let's say, it's in the richer West, how do you answer her question? It's really need. I mean, it's not even greed, you know. Greed is sometimes need as well. So how do you tackle that we should not drain our wetlands, which we are doing, because we think wetlands and grasslands are wastelands. So it's a very complicated thing. It's environmental versus economics.
I embellish her question a bit. Shukanta Chowdhury, who's a very, very well-known academic, in a conversation with Amitabh Ghosh, spoke of this problem, and he said that, isn't it a pity that Calcutta's horizon is being replaced by a skyline? I think it is a problem with many of our cities. Look at Bombay, parts of it. So it's really an interesting question. What would you say to this?
It's not a question of aesthetics, you know. In this case,
that's the precise point. His argument wasn't aesthetic. He said that horizon is being replaced by a skyline.
Yeah.
So it's actually it's an indictment, as she was saying.
Yeah. So there's a fine line between saying we shouldn't feel hopeless and between being glib about the solutions. We have to find the space somewhere in between that. I think Bikram is very right to point us to also, and I think the lady who just asked the question, to the politics of it, right? One of the reasons that transformation has happened is the local elected official. If she's elected in an area where there's much more revenue being generated, it basically, some of that gets, some of that accrues to her, she passes that up the ladder, she becomes more influential, and so on and so forth. That is the logic of the system that we have, and that's a very difficult logic to fight against. In order to change that conversation, again, the issue starts with changing that conversation, right? Which again, Bikram is right, there are theoretical ideas, but they don't translate down. The theoretical idea is, if you actually costed the gains that a wetland gives you, you would find that the benefits from it are much larger, more likely than not, than all this revenue generation from shopping malls and concrete and so on and so forth. But we don't have systems which cost those wetlands. So then you take a step back and you say, okay, can we put in place some hurdles and some hoops where before you transform a wetland to a shopping mall, you have to do a certain assessment, you have to ask this question. So we don't have planning processes. If Minal was here, she would tell us, we don't have planning processes where you ask the question, what are the costs of what you're doing, including the environmental costs? What are the gains of what you're doing, including the environmental gains? And then make an all things considered decision. And second, you embed that process in a larger process where the public gets to see the results and comment on it. So we have a process of environmental impact assessments in India that are meant to do just that. But they're short-circuited, entirely short-circuited. So that's where, again, so you have tools like environmental impact assessments and cost-benefit analysis and things like this, but they're not working because they're not transparent and they're not embedded in a process where the citizens and the public can stand up and say, wait a second, we're going to lose from this decision. We don't want this to go ahead. So again, it comes back to the sort of citizen activism to demand these things and to know what your rights are and what you can ask for. Right? So a lot of this, if you're going to shift, so my answer is you can't bypass the politics, and to shift the politics, you need to be organized and informed.
You had a question for a long
Yes.
time. Yeah.
My question is about something Navroz sir addressed, but any of you can answer. So he addressed that we have in India, there's innovation, there's what is necessary is innovation versus urbanization. And then he addressed that adaptation is necessary as well as climate, the decrease in climate. But the thing is, as a collective behavior as a whole, we are adapting. Like every year there is a rise in temperatures, there is, every summer is getting more hotter than the previous one, and every winter is more crude. And then there is, because of landscape changes also, the cash crops, the quality of the cash crop that was before is not now. And so even if the farmers try their hard, try their best, the agriculture sector try their best, the thing which is going bad is they are not reinforced enough to work that hard again. Because if they work that hard again, the land, because of the changing in the landscapes, because of the changing in the climate, we are not getting good quality products. And that's why we shift to markets like Walmart and markets like Easy Day. The thing is, what I really wanted to know is what is more important right now, because as a collective behavior we are adapting, but should we address to the instances of the climate changes, because we know that the sea level is rising, the glaciers are melting, and because of that cyclones and various other atrocities are there. But should we know the information at the root level?
If I may interrupt, what is your question? We
Yes,
need to keep it brief, okay, so that we can answer it.
Should we know, information is needed at the root level, which we do not, and when something like Miss Greta came up, the meme society and everyone mocked her. So what is more important, adaptation or the decrease in the climate? What is more important?
I can't answer really the question because I haven't understood it, but it looked more like a statement than the thing. So
If you can sum up in one line.
In one line.
What is your question?
Maybe two.
Basically, what is more important, adaptation or climate change?
I don't know.
Which is, of course, climate change, but
Yeah. I think we should really running out of time, so we can take another question. Another couple.
We have many. So one thing maybe what we can do is just collect the questions and divide it among them so that we can answer in one go.
Like when I was growing up in 80s and 90s, there used to be advertisements in Doordarshan about family planning. A lot, every program. So shouldn't there be advertisements in local language, plastic hai, kharab hai, isse cancer hota hai. Means a lot of, so that an average people on the street can understand who are not so educated in India.
Yes, I think it's, just to answer this question in 1 second, yes, it's a very good idea. People must know. We must sort of, pass on information and benefits to as many people as possible.
That is
So which-
actually a very good idea.
it's
Communication.
you know, we should use the powerful media in India. Because private media is not going to help you. So government, Doordarshan and all, we should, use that to pass on in such public information.
So this question is for Mr. Grewal. Yeah. So, Bikram, the question is that you were talking about the para boys. Yeah. So, disaster management and migration management, those are the two things you talked about mainly. How can we involve the para boys and not wait for the establishment to have a plan?
Well, all right.
Anybody has? Yeah, just take the questions maybe. Next.
So it's a two-part question. My first question is that even though in India we are nobody is talking about climate change being a hoax, but even still before the elections, none of the parties really discuss about climate change policies. So what can we do about it so that we go to a scenario where not just AAP but every political party is discussing about climate change policies? And the second question is, being a geologist and our main recruiters being oil and coal companies, and we know that gradually the workforce is going to reduce. So how do we prepare for that when we know that our opportunities are going to get reduced because of the greener and efficient policies being implemented? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Two questions. Who else is there? Yeah.
My question is quite straightforward. The question is, our country is aiming for an economic inflation and always more economy. So how is economic inflation a kind of hindrance to climate curing, or is it helping climate change, or what is it doing? Is it to be held accountable?
You mean the economic slowdown?
No, the economic inflation. Country is always inflation, right? How is it to be held accountable for that?
Okay, there were one more question from this lady, and then we will stop the questions. There was a young lady there. Oh, there are two of you. Okay, the question's really brief. Maybe one line.
I have a question regarding public policies as well. I am an urban planner. How can we influence public policies? Is the government doing enough? And second question is, what technologies can we use to curb climate change, like pollution, etc.?
Okay, you had another question.
Yeah. So I work in the renewable sector, in the solar sector to be specific. So this is an entirely market-driven sector, right? So there is this entire scheme of 100 gigawatt by 2020, and that is how the market is progressing. But when we meet the customers, there is a very underlying uncertainty and skepticism in their minds regarding the performance of these modules, of solar modules, because they don't know how it is going to do. So what is your take on the skepticism, how to sweep away the skepticism, how to tackle it?
I will take this question. Maybe then I'll take your question at last. The para question, Bikram?
You asked about the para boys. The para boys is a classic example of social activism. The muck that is left after the puja, pandals go down. Para boys are actually getting into it. So this is what we need more and more. And if we say that help is not going to come from the establishment, it is people like the para boys who should take over the movement. The rest of the questions, Navroz, are yours, really.
Okay. The rest of it, yeah.
Well, I'll try and be brief. There was a question raised it's worth dealing with, that is climate change a hoax? And it's interesting that actually in India that's not received so much resonance. I don't think people doubt the science that much, they're just worried about what to do about it. I think it's also worth noting that there's a track record of some oil and gas companies investing money in disinformation, particularly in the US, and building skepticism. I think that's now out in the open. There are these papers by Exxon and so on and so forth. So in terms of getting it on the agenda, I come back to this point. I think it's really important for us to have the conversation at two levels in India. Yes, we need to be aware about climate change, we need to be aware about this complex science, about what it means for cyclones and droughts and so on and so forth. But in terms of action, we need to relate it to things that we care about for the average voter. Their cities, what kinds of support farmers get from the government for the kinds of agriculture they grow, what does it mean for star rating for efficiency, for efficiency in appliances. We need to translate this big, giant topic into something that is much more tangible and organize ourselves for action around those things. Then I think it's much more manageable. That's how we get it on the agenda. In terms of career choices as a geologist, I think you might want to talk to our colleague over here who works in the renewable energy industry. I'm not sure what else I can say in terms of this. I think it's an interesting question as to you know, a profession like geology has, as you say, been closely tied to a particular industry, and that's also going to be disrupted and shaken up. Yeah, so the growth and policy very quickly. So yes, growth has been assumed to be part of the agenda. Now, can we deal with climate change while still growing? There are two sets of views. One is a set of people have said, yes, we can transition to green growth. So we invest in renewable energy, we invest in electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. Bikram rightly said that the automobile industry is super powerful in India, accounts for a lot of jobs. Can they be urged to pivot to electric vehicles, for example? That would be kind of a green growth strategy. Other people are saying, given the scale of change that we need, we're not going to get there if we insist on growth. We need to start thinking about a steady state economy, which is this term that has come into vogue. What does it mean if our economies are not always keyed to more growth? Maybe we can increase quality of life, but it need not be tied directly to growth. So it's a very active debate going on. And in terms of the policy process, as somebody who's tried to engage the policy process, there are very few ways into the process. A lot of ideas come from who you know, getting an idea to the right person at the right time. It's not a very considered, careful process, which is also why the renewable energy industry is given an incentive with one hand and then it's taken away with the other hand, introducing lots of policy uncertainty for investors. So we don't have the best policy process in the world. Again, it's something that we have to try and work on.
I'll very quickly answer your question on renewables. The problem is that there's a real lack of knowledge. It is such a relatively a new field, and the PM Solar Mission is actually very powerful and important document. You should get hold of it and read it if you already probably have. So, you know, which we sort of battle at every level, because people simply don't know enough. And to Navroz's point, our establishment doesn't help. One hand, you talk about the solar mission, and the then Prime Minister and, the then Power Minister and now Commerce Minister announces a big incentive for coal the very next day. It is totally mixed signals. It's lessening, but it's going to be a long haul. It's not going to be, and it's really up to people like you, so that, you know, you learn, you equip yourselves when you talk to either customers or policymakers. I think that's going to be not a very satisfactory answer, but one. So we have completely run out of time. So, and thanks for being so engaged. That was really lovely. But one line closing comment from both of our panelists.
I think we have done enough government bashing. We all have to put our hearts together into it, because the problem is much, much more serious than you think. And this is the time. You don't have very much time left.
I think at the risk of sending mixed messages, the problem is incredibly serious. Things are poised to get worse, but I think that we have to hold on to the spaces that we have, and a lot of it is around actually awareness and organizing for concrete things in our day-to-day lives. We can't be paralyzed by the scale of this problem. We have to translate it into problems that are manageable, and that is a possibility. That is something that can be done.
Just closing it, you've been a great audience, thank you. It's very important to understand that each of us is a player and a stakeholder. We cannot look to the government or the media or the political parties alone to provide solutions. It's up to all of us. And I would really urge you to read the book. It's a very reader-friendly format, and it's free. It's downloadable from the Oxford University site. Have a look. I had a look, and I was much benefited by it. Thank you very much.